That is how she learns to behave. The words were soft, deliberately casual, the kind of sentence you hear once and then cannot unhear for the rest of your life. They landed in the room like a verdict. Then a hand met my daughter's face. I remember the sound of it, a sharp, hollow clap against skin, the clink of a wine glass set too quickly on the table, the scrape of a chair as someone pushed back. I remember my own heart racing, not from surprise, but from the precise knowledge of what those moments meant. I had spent 32 years in courtrooms reading the anatomy of human cruelty and the language of protection orders. I was a family law attorney. I had seen patterns. But I had never imagined those patterns coming home in full color, in front of me, across my kitchen table. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 57. I have practiced family law for more than 3 decades. Today, I am telling you what happened the night my son-in-law struck my daughter and his mother applauded. I'm telling it from the place where professional training met parental instinct, where legal strategy collided with the urgent need to get a frightened woman to safety. If this hits home for you, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. City is fine. I read every one. Ariana had always been a kind, bright certainty in our family. From the time she was small, she loved to take things apart, to unscrew the back of a broken radio just to see the gears, the wires, the way something that had stopped working could be studied and sometimes fixed. She went on to study chemical engineering because the world felt cleaner in equations than in people. In her hands, a beaker looked less like a battlefield and more like an opportunity. We had Sunday dinners at my late husband Robert's house for years. Pot roast, rosemary roasted potatoes, a stubbornly undercooked carrot or two, and a living room full of laughter. Robert taught us how to love with steadiness. Make the coffee each morning. Listen until the silence tells you something. Apologize before it becomes a mountain. I often think back to those dinners now because they show how fast a life that seems whole can fray. Ariana met Mark at a conference where he made an offhand joke and then fixed her coffee machine with a knowing smile. He was charming, quick, funny in a way that made people lean in. He had the kind of charisma that reads as confidence until confidence turns into ownership. At first, his attention felt like a relief after years of being quietly overlooked by the world. He noticed what we all did not: Ariana's research presentations, her dry humor, the precise way she arranged her notes. He sent flowers that were thoughtful rather than showy, and he offered to drive across town for her when the train was canceled. There was tenderness. There were gestures that felt like care. But the first small red flags were there the way hairlines show gray, subtle, then stubborn. He corrected her in front of colleagues, not harshly, but in a tone that suggested she should be grateful to be noticed. He made jokes about her friends being too much or too loud. He complained in passing that she didn't spend enough time with him. Ariana laughed these moments off. She told me later that it had felt like proof she mattered, that someone had entered her orbit in a way that others had not. The pattern of control often begins with attention that becomes claiming. Mark's claims arrived as questions at first. Where were you going? Who was at the dinner? Why do you wear that to the lab? They were presented as concern, but shaped to isolate. Friends gently discouraged, lab invitations postponed, a long-anticipated trip canceled because we should save money. When you love someone, you sometimes interpret these adjustments as compromise. I wanted to believe Ariana's reading of it, that in time he would smooth out, that in time he would be the partner she deserved. The honeymoon to abuse arc is a textbook thing I have written about and argued for in court. When it happens to your child, the textbook becomes a wound map you trace with your finger. The early abuse appeared in small infractions, a shove in a hallway that was explained as accidental,
an angry text at 2 a.m. that turned into a promise that he wouldn't do it again. Then there was gaslighting, which is when the abuser tells you the reality you experienced never happened or was your fault. "You're overreacting," Mark would say, or "I was joking," or "you made me do it." The words collided with Ariana's self-trust until she doubted the definitions of normal. She began to minimize things to herself the way people sometimes bandage a wound with a Band-Aid and pretend the bleeding has stopped. I will not rehearse every bruise. That would be voyeurism, not testimony. But I will say this. I watched my daughter become a smaller version of herself. She covered up injuries. She canceled plans she loved. She explained away comments and late-night phone calls. She told herself that if she behaved differently, cooler, quieter, more appreciative, the unrest would stop. This is the cruel alchemy of abuse. It convinces the survivor that their survival depends on contortion. The first time Mark struck her with intent, not a shove or a reflex, but a closed fist against her arm, she told me she thought at first she had pulled the bra strap. That is not a denial or a lie. It is the brain's shelter when reality is too violent to land whole. Then it happened again. Then the distance between the incidents narrowed. Each time, the pattern tightens like a rope. I tried to be careful. My profession can make you overconfident. Familiarity with statutes, court procedures, and protective mechanisms can lead a parent to believe that the machinery of justice will react as quickly as your own heartbreak.
I was determined not to let bureaucracy slow me down, to treat my panic as a tool, precise, procedural, purposeful. March had been a cold month. It had been a year of intermittent custody disagreements, of whispered arguments overheard through walls, of friends who texted less until they were texting never. Ariana had come to our house that Sunday evening with a forced smile. Mark was there, of course, wearing the same practiced easy grin that had once won people to his side. Helen Harrison, his mother, had come as well, for the first time since the engagement had been announced. Helen had a presence that filled a room, small in stature, voice like a bell, and eyes that measured. She had been one of those mothers-in-law you would not suspect until you noticed the way she did not ask about Ariana's work, only about how she would fit in to the family. There had been a curious coolness in her smiles that always made me edge closer to my daughter at gatherings. We sat down in my kitchen. The house smelled like the last of Robert's pot roast, the rosemary still warm in the room. The light was the low, forgiving light of a March evening, warm, softened. The conversation began small: weather, lab frustrations, neighborhood chatter. I could hear the strain under Ariana's laughter. Mark leaned forward and told a story about a colleague who had put a woman in her place at a meeting. The story landed in the room like a spark thrown on dry tinder. Helen laughed in a way that was too loud for the circle of us. It was the laugh that said, without irony, that dominance was a family value. When Mark reached for Ariana's wrist, it did not feel accidental. His fingers were firm enough to leave a single, precise pressure point. Ariana flinched. Her glass trembled. I asked a question, a polite, neutral question, and he answered with impatience. Then he stood. He raised his hand. The first slap was an audible cut. The sound made everyone freeze. I remember thinking, as an attorney, how likely it would be that the neighbors had heard, that this sound would be evidence in a way a bruised arm could never be. The second slap landed before a single person moved. The third was delivered with the kind of calm that is practiced, the brutal efficiency of someone who believes they own the narrative. After the third, Helen clapped. Not a gasp, not a plea, slow, deliberate applause. That is how she learns to behave, Helen said again, that bell of a voice closing the room. In the seconds that followed, everything became both very small and very large. Time condensed.
My training and my body moved at the same second. No one in my family is a stranger to force when that force is legal and righteous. My hands reached for my phone while my other hand reached for Ariana's. I did not scream. I did not faint. I knew that panicking would create chaos. Calm would create a record. I pressed record. My voice on the video is quiet. I asked Helen to repeat what she had said. I asked Mark to explain why he had struck her. I spoke in the way I always do in courtrooms, direct, unhurried, observant. I told my daughter to stand if she could. I told the children to go to the den and turn on a movie. I told the person across from me, without raising my voice, to leave my house if he cared for his evening. A lot of people imagine that a lawyer's instinct would be to act immediately with arrest and paperwork and to file the motions that put systems into motion. That is true, but the lawyer in me also knows the constraints of civil procedure, criminal proof, and what evidence holds weight in the eyes of a judge. What matters in domestic violence cases is not only the force of what happened, but the traceable record that proves it. So I recorded. I asked witnesses to stay. I marked the time. I called Commander Miller. Commander Miller has been our family's police contact for years. He is the kind of officer who understands domestic dynamics, the kind of professional whose voice brings immediate credibility. I knew he would respond with the combination of legal rigor and sensitivity this night demanded. I told him exactly what had happened, that there had been a physical assault inside my home, that there were witnesses, that the assailant's mother had made a statement that directly corroborated motive and intent. I told him I had a recording. He told me to secure Ariana and to expect him and an officer within minutes. We hung up. I held my daughter while she cried, small, exhausted sobs that felt like someone exhaling under the weight of a long, bad dream. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "Mom, I'm so stupid." I was furious, not because of the insult, but because she thought she had failed to see this when the failure was not hers to bear. I told her she was not stupid. I told her she was brave for staying. I told her we were going to do what needed to be done. By the time Commander Miller arrived, I had a written timeline, a list of witnesses, and the still warm recording on my phone. I handed him the device and I watched him listen in that way first responders listen, with the opposite of judgment, with attention calibrated to fact. He explained what would happen next. An arrest was a possible immediate response if probable cause existed. Probable cause meaning there was a reasonable belief that a crime had been committed and the person arrested had committed it. He told me that a domestic assault charge was likely given the audio and witnesses, and that the presence of Helen's applause and statement could be framed as aiding or abetting, as an act that encouraged the commission of the crime. There are people who read about arrests and imagine them like the ending of a movie: one handcuff, one sob, then clemency. Real life is messier. The officers moved carefully, respectful of the dynamics and of safety. Mark and Helen were asked to step into the hallway. There were questions, then compliance. They were taken into custody. I felt a physical slump of relief and a simultaneous sharpened anxiety. Arrests do not fix everything. They simply start a process. Evidence can be disputed. Lawyers will regroup. Families will fracture in ways permanence can complicate. We arranged for a temporary protective order, an emergency form of injunction that, when granted, requires the alleged abuser to stay away from the protected person and can also include vacating a shared home. The threshold for an emergency protective order is lower than a long-term restraining order that requires a more formal hearing, but it provides immediate safety. The protective order was entered quickly. It felt like covering a wound with a sterile dressing. It did not heal the injury. It stopped fresh harm. Immediately after the arrests, I began to anticipate the backlash. It is an unfortunate expertise of my life to expect that power mates will use power to retaliate. My experience told me abusers do not always fold when law is applied properly. Their families mobilize. Their resources can be used to challenge evidence, contact witnesses, and smear reputations. The moment you step into a courtroom against a connected family, you are stepping into a system that can be persuaded by influence as much as by truth. We took photographs of Ariana's face, of the red mark where the skin had reddened, of the wine glass knocked from her hand. I filed the police report. I asked Commander Miller to note Helen's words in the report verbatim. The police took statements from neighbors who had heard the slap and from the friends who had been at our house. I provided the recording to the detective assigned to the case, and I made sure the copy was time-stamped and backed up in multiple locations. These were the basic, unromantic steps that preserve memory and convert it to admissible evidence. Ariana was shaken but resolute. Even amid fear, she spoke with the quiet, stubborn clarity she had always had. She wanted the charges pursued. She wanted the protective order to hold. She wanted, in that moment, the clean line between the domesticity she loved and the violence that had crept in. Her agency here is critical to state outright. She chose to press charges, to participate, to re-enter a system that is neither kind nor simple to navigate. We took practical matters too. Phone numbers that needed changing, locks to be replaced, text threads to be preserved as evidence, emails to be printed. I instructed her on what to save and how, not as a lecture, but as a way to give her power over the process. For decades, I had taught clients to document, to keep receipts, to lock down accounts, because the smallest detail can hold a case together. That night, those practices felt less like bureaucracy and more like a lifeline. Word spread. Not the formal press release kind of word, but the way neighborhoods absorb news and rearrange themselves around it. There were texts from friends that were gentle and then quiet. Some colleagues of mine expressed immediate support. Others, in my field, asked legal questions that felt like they came from a distance rather than from the human center of the moment. In the days that followed, a few people I had once trusted said things like, "Careful, you're playing with fire," meaning that we had challenged a family who had history and influence. Those words were a reminder that truth and power wage a constant war. I should say, before moving on, that every decision I made that night was chosen to preserve Ariana's autonomy and dignity. The protective order, the arrests, were tools to buy us time. I did not want the court to speak louder than my daughter's voice. The court needed to make space for her voice. There is a dangerous tendency in abuse narratives to believe that parents or advocates can simply substitute their will for that of the survivor. In my practice and in my life as a mother, I have learned that the work is collaborative. You stand beside someone and help them map the doorway to safety. Within 48 hours of the arrests, we filed for preliminary charges and scheduled the hearings. The Harrison family, to be expected, did not accept the facts as presented. They retained counsel and issued a terse statement that they were reviewing the circumstances and trusting the legal process. That phrasing, "trust the legal process," is often deployed by the connected as a way of signaling patience when their patience is a strategy. I expected it. I was not naive about the storm brewing, but none of that dimmed the relief that momentarily wrapped the house like a blanket. In my law office, I began to prepare for pushback the way a surgeon prepares for hemorrhage: anticipate, have instruments ready, and steady hands. I cataloged communications we might expect, preemptive narratives to shape the public perception, private legal threats such as counterclaims for defamation, and professional pressures that could be applied to Ariana's employment. I had seen all these levers used before: an IRS complaint used as intimidation, anonymous bar complaints to cast doubt on an attorney's integrity, smear campaigns across social platforms to drown facts under noise. I made a mental list of resources we could mobilize: trusted PR consultants, forensic accountants if needed, a civil litigator who specialized in counter-litigation, and, if it came to it, a crisis manager who could handle the social media tide. What I did not foresee that week was the speed at which whispers could harden into a line of attack. People outside the immediate circle found narratives that suited them. Others who felt the weight of the Harrisons' reputation chose silence, as silence is sometimes a shield. The first night I slept no more than an hour. The adrenaline wore off, and then a small, precise fatigue set in, the kind you feel after performing an emergency procedure.
A look into that first week is important because it reveals how the mechanics of abuse are not confined to the gesture of a strike. They extend into reputations, financial pressure, and institutional leverage. When someone with money and connections chooses to fight back, those moves are not always righteous. They are strategic. But the first week also revealed something else. Courage has a way of spreading. A neighbor who had once been reticent called to say she had heard the slap and would testify. A woman from Ariana's lab who had once been distant sent a message reading simply, "I believe you." Those notes mattered. They were small salves against the rawness of public scrutiny. I will not pretend the days were easy. We filed paperwork, attended interviews, and prepared for the inevitable media curiosity. There were legal conversations about the precise charge the district attorney would pursue, about the likelihood of diversion programs versus arraignment, about whether the public defender would be involved. I remember one conversation in which a colleague urged caution to let the process unfold without overcommitting in public. I understood the strategic rationale. I simply could not ignore the emotional reality that my daughter needed to feel seen and supported. One evening, after a long meeting with the assigned prosecutor, Ariana sat on my back patio and told me she felt like she had been living underwater and someone had finally turned on a light. She said the music in the lab sounded different to her, that she noticed details she hadn't before. It was a precious and fragile moment. She was not cured, and the legal fight had only just begun, but she was awake to the possibility of a life untethered to shame. Then, just as we felt a tentative foothold, we received our first sign that the case would not be contained to our family kitchen. A short, sharp email arrived at my office address, an anonymous message suggesting that the Harrison family had friends in high places and that pursuing the matter might be expensive for us. The phrasing was thinly veiled intimidation. I felt a familiar cold slide down my spine. It's the feeling you get when you realize the other side has the appetite to use leverage. That is where I will stop for a moment, because the next steps took us into territory where law, money, and social influence collided in ways that threatened to drown the facts under a flood of counter-narratives. Up to that point, we had been acting from the center of truth, the recording, the witnesses, the protective order. What came next would test the structures that are supposed to protect survivors, institutions, reputations, and the often unequal access to resources. It would also change the shape of the battle from an immediate moment of violence to a prolonged campaign in which the stakes would be legal, personal, and at times frighteningly public. The email arrived like a single cold grain of sand in an otherwise familiar shoe, small, insignificant, but enough to make you limp. It said, in a tone that smelled of a threat wrapped in civility, that the Harrisons had influence, friends in offices that mattered, and that pursuing the charges might be expensive. It did not say it directly, but the implication was clear. They would make the fight personal, professional, and financial. It got worse before it got better. Within days, the smear machinery began to hum. Anonymous social media accounts appeared that used doctored photos and selective clips from old family gatherings to paint Ariana as unstable, dramatic, or opportunistic. Someone opened an online petition demanding leniency for Mark, couched in language about family reputation and concern for all parties. My office began to receive what looked like routine audits. A notice from the State Revenue Office about a return I'd filed years ago that suddenly warranted review. A preliminary inquiry from the Bar Association.
an email purporting to be from a major donor asking for clarification about a pro bono case I'd handled. The tactics were familiar. Pressure applied to the support structure surrounding a person until those supports begin to wobble. At first, I cataloged these things the way I would evidence in a discovery folder: dates, headers, sender addresses, screenshots. Then the campaign sharpened. Ariana's employer at the lab, a respectable private firm with ties to some of the Harrisons' professional network, asked for an impromptu meeting. The meeting, I learned later, was not without its coercive undertones. An HR representative suggesting that Ariana take a leave to focus on personal matters, and hints that negative publicity could jeopardize grant funding. She left shaken. 2 weeks later, she was told the lab could no longer guarantee her project support. It was a way of removing a foothold. The legal world is not immune to gossip, and reputation can be weaponized as effectively as evidence. Someone filed an anonymous complaint with the state bar, claiming that my handling of a prior custody case had been erratic. The bar opened a preliminary inquiry into my conduct. For a week, I moved through the courthouse feeling simultaneously unmoved. The bar process is a serious formalism, but usually slow, and exposed. I had done nothing wrong in my career, yet the existence of a complaint is enough to seed doubt in the minds of colleagues and clients. The Harrisons' reach, when it flexed, folded laundry that had been kept private. I will not lie, we were frightened. There were nights when Ariana and I sat together and counted contingencies like a mother and daughter counting stitches. If they went after her job, would we find alternatives? If they pushed the bar complaint, would some of my longtime clients hesitate to speak up in court? If the IRS audit escalated, could our resources withstand prolonged scrutiny?
These were not idle worries. They were the pragmatic arithmetic of survival when the other side believes the advantage of leverage is worth paying for. But there was also stubbornness. It is one of the less glamorous qualities that sustains cases through the dull middle, the refusal to be cowed into silence. I had practiced long enough to know that counterattack is often a predictable part of defense. Preparation is medicine. We called the PR consultant I had used once before for a pro bono family case. We engaged a forensic accountant to look at the scope of the audit notices. I reached out to 2 colleagues who knew how to shepherd bar inquiries away from baseless rumor and back toward statutory analysis. Most importantly, Ariana and I talked about what we would not allow this campaign to do: redefine her as the problem, make her the scandal. Then the low point arrived not as a single scene, but as a series of small collapses. A former friend who had attended our family dinners sent a curt message: "Better you keep the peace." An old neighbor implied that making this public was an unnecessary spectacle. And the lab, where Ariana's identity had been forged, informed her that funding for her fellowship would be delayed pending an internal review. She called me in the middle of the night, voice small and raw, and said, "Maybe I should just go back to him. At least it would be familiar." Those words were like ice in my veins. They revealed the cruelest calculus of abuse, the option to go back to the known harm because the unknown looked scarier. I wanted to shake her, to tell her that safety might be imperfect, but was better than the terror of being destabilized by a public fall. What I did instead was sit in silence with her for a long time, and then I reminded her gently of what she had already done. She had documented, she had called out the truth, she had chosen to pursue a life beyond the kitchen where hands could speak with permission. Her choice to fight was itself an act of reclaiming. Then an envelope arrived. It was unremarkable in its outer appearance. No return address, ordinary brown paper. I set it on my desk and forgot it for a day, as if ignoring the envelope might make boredom its only content. That night, after the house had quieted, I opened it. Inside were recordings, documents, and photographs. The recordings were the kind you hope never to hear, because they reveal the underside of private conversations and the sounds of people doing the things they do when they think no one is listening.
Someone had collected intercepted phone calls, voicemail fragments, and an audio file labeled in a scrawled hand that read, Helen Ray. The photographs included images of an older medical bill with handwriting that suggested a different author, a set of handwritten notes that looked like entries in a small black ledger.
There was also a letter, unsigned, that suggested a witness willing to corroborate details only a family insider would know. I felt the air empty out of the room. This was not the first time anonymous evidence had popped into a case I was following, but the content suggested something larger than a campaign of intimidation. They hinted at a pattern in which the Harrison family had not merely defended a son, but had protected a narrative for years. The audio file labeled Helen Ray was the one that made my hands tremble. It contained, in muffled clarity, a voice I recognized from family gatherings. Helen, speaking softly, discussing a moment at the end of her husband Ray's life. The content of that fragment, taken with the ledger and the old medical note, raised uncomfortable questions about what had happened years before. We did the prudent thing. I took copies, stored originals in multiple secure locations, and alerted Commander Miller and the detective already assigned to the assault case. Anonymous evidence must be handled with care. The law is clear. Evidence obtained through unlawful means can be challenged and sometimes excluded. But anonymous tips and records often point investigators towards sources that can be lawfully explored. What began as an anonymous package became the thread that, pulled carefully, revealed more. At this point, I must admit an ambiguity. Certain recordings in that envelope were later challenged as to their manner of acquisition. Some of them were potentially obtained without a warrant. I mention that now because the court later had to address chain of custody and admissibility questions. However, those recordings, even when contested, produced leads that investigators could verify by other lawful means. That legal distinction, the difference between a contested recording and the independent evidence it yields, is a fine but critical line. It was the difference in our case between a dead end and a warrant. Albert Harrison reached out quietly 3 days after the package arrived. I had met him once at a distant cousin's funeral. He was not close with the main branch of the family and had always seemed uneasy with their more public members. In a short email, he said he had information that might be important and asked if we could meet with the detective. Albert sat across from me in a conference room small enough to feel intimate and large enough for the gravity of what he held. He was tremulous, careful, the type of witness whose conscience had finally outweighed loyalty. He told a story about inconsistencies in the year Ray Harrison had died. He spoke about a late-night call he had received years earlier and about an argument he had overheard in a gated room that did not match the Harrisons' public account. He produced letters that indicated payments on Ray's medical account did not match the dates claimed by the main family narrative. Albert had been living with quiet doubt. The anonymous package, he said, spurred him to act. Albert agreed to testify. His willingness to speak was the kind of pressure that can tip a balance, not because a single testimony is irrefutable, but because it opens the door to corroboration. Investigators used his statements to obtain warrants for old bank records and for communications that had not been previously examined. Those records confirmed discrepancies, dates that did not align with the public death notice, invoices in different names, and a series of messages between Helen and a household manager that suggested an effort to shape narratives in the weeks before Ray's death. Once the detectives had the warrants, they could follow a legal chain. Forensic analysis of phone metadata connected communications in ways that the anonymous package alone could not. A previously unexamined voicemail was authenticated by the phone company. A ledger's handwriting was corroborated by an expert. Crucially, the detectives' new warrants led to documents that were lawfully obtained and admissible in court.
This is how investigations should proceed. A suspicious tip leads to lawful steps that produce evidence the court can use without running afoul of constitutional protections. These developments changed the scope of the litigation. What had been a domestic assault case became part of a larger inquiry into older family secrets. Helen, already implicated in encouraging the assault by her applause and words that night in my kitchen, was now faced with questions about her involvement in the events surrounding her husband's death years earlier. The district attorney, after reviewing the chain of evidence, added counts related to hindering an investigation and, later, to more serious charges once the evidence permitted those filings. I do not recite these steps to sensationalize. I recount them because they matter to how the courtroom drama unfolded. Meanwhile, the Harrisons' machine continued to run. A second wave of legal maneuvers arrived: defamation countersuits, an attempt to convene a civil pressure campaign against us, and whispers of professional consequences aimed at the scientist community. But by then, we had more than a recording and a protective order. We had witnesses, corroborated documents, and a detective willing to pursue what the record suggested. Court proceeded the way these matters often do, slowly, punctuated by spurts of intensity. Pre-trial hearings debated the admissibility of certain materials. I watched magistrates wade through motions that argued over whether the anonymous recordings were obtained lawfully or whether they were fruit of the poisonous tree and thus tainted. Judges like Magistrate Hernandez asked hard procedural questions about chain of custody and whether the evidence had led to independent lawful discovery.
The district attorney, mindful of these constraints, explained patiently how the warrants had been obtained based on probable cause drawn from the anonymous material and then corroborated independently. I learned, again, that the law has its own rhythm. It is not always swift, but when it moves with justification, it can yield consequences that are careful and consequential. In a pretrial hearing, a judge ruled that certain recordings would be excluded because they were obtained without proper authorization. Others were allowed because the detective had developed independent probable cause sufficient to obtain warrants. It was a nuanced decision and one that shaped the government's theory at trial. The Harrisons' public relations strategy faltered under the weight of concrete evidence. People who had previously been reticent found it easier to speak when documents did not smell like rumor. The neighbor who had first called to say she'd heard the slap gave a detailed sworn statement. The lab colleague who had texted, "I believe you," agreed to testify about ways Mark had tried to interfere with Ariana's work and social contacts. Faces that had seemed blank in the first week began to color with empathy. Courage, when it sees light, often invites more courage. We reached the part of the battle every parent fears and every lawyer prepares for: the courtroom. I am not a drama lover in litigating. I respect facts. But courtrooms, in their solemnity, contained theater of another kind, the theater of consequences. Mark's trial began with jury selection that took weeks. The defense attempted to frame Ariana's actions as part of a messy relationship, and they called character witnesses who painted Mark as a man of devotion. It is part of the defense script to humanize the accused, and the jury must weigh that humanization against the weight of multiple witnesses, time-stamped recordings, and physical evidence. I watched Ariana prepare for testimony with a tenacity that steadied me. She worked with an expert, a clinical psychologist, Dr. Peters, who helped her articulate the pattern of abuse in a way that a jury could understand without turning the witness into an exhibit. Dr. Peters explained how abuse narrows a person's world, how gaslighting rewires memory, and how survivors often normalize what has been done to them. Expert testimony like this helps jurors see behavior not as isolated acts, but as a pattern that reveals intent and control. Her testimony was not a spectacle. She spoke with granite clarity and a tremor that made the truth human. She described the sequence of events, the phone calls, the isolation, the physical acts, and measured phrases. She did not dwell on the worst in forensic detail. She described impact. When the recording from my kitchen was played in court, with the judge's permission for the allowed segments, there was a collective intake of breath in the courtroom.
Helen's laughter, Mark's hands, those sounds could not be wished away. People heard what I had heard that night, the deliberate rhythm of domination and a mother's approval that closed the room's moral aperture. Cross-examination, as always, sought to dismantle credibility. The defense attorney asked questions meant to sow doubt. Why had Ariana stayed? Had she not at times been affectionate in texts? Was she motivated by attention? We anticipated those lines and prepared. The prosecution countered with a timeline of documented changes, a shift in Ariana's social calendar, text logs showing controlling messages, and witnesses who corroborated moments of escalation. The documentary record, emails, photos, messages saved as PDFs, can be remarkably stubborn when attorneys fight to reduce noise to facts. The jury returned guilty for the assault charge and for violation of the protective order that followed. I will not tell you that the verdict erased what had happened. It did not. But it was a validation in a public way that truth, when marshaled carefully, can push through influence and narrative manipulation. Mark was sentenced according to the statutory guidelines, receiving a term that included community supervision and requirements for counseling and no-contact provisions. Sentencing is a complicated moment. It balances punishment, rehabilitation, and public safety. The judge's decision reflected an assessment that the pattern of behavior required intervention beyond mere admonition. Helen's case proceeded separately. The new evidence changed the stakes of her trial and created a far different narrative than the one she had presented in public statements. At her trial, the prosecution presented the authenticated ledger entries, bank transfers, and witness testimony, including Albert's account. The jury, after hearing the totality of the evidence, found her guilty on the counts that had been brought, including, ultimately, complicity in hindering the investigation around Ray's death. Her conviction was not automatic, and defenses were mounted, but the court's process, when fed by corroborated evidence, led to a verdict that recognized the legal weight of her actions. I will be careful here. Convictions are facts in a court record, but they do not serve as a universal moral scoreboard for everyone who ever knew the parties. They do, however, matter to victims and survivors who need formal recognition that harm was done. Convictions create legal consequences that protect and set boundaries. In our family, those verdicts created space, not just for punishment, but for a possible turning, a chance to rebuild without the frequent shadow of intimidation. There were peripheral consequences I had expected. A prosecutor who had been rumored to be friendly with the family recused himself early on and later resigned from his office under public pressure. A local judge with social ties to the Harrisons stepped down from a committee role. Those departures were documented and painful for those involved, but they are the sort of institutional shifts that sometimes accompany the exposure of influence-driven attempts to bend process. I relate these facts not to gloat, but to underline how the arc of accountability can expand beyond single verdicts. One of the most human scenes in the process happened in a visiting room at the county detention center. Ariana asked to see Mark under supervised conditions. She wanted closure, not confrontation. In a room too bright for the sorrow it contained, she sat across from a man who had been her partner, who had been a presence inside her life and her home. She did not raise her voice. Her voice was steady because it had been fortified by months of therapy and legal preparation. "Why?" she asked simply. Mark looked at her with a complexity of emotions that were his to hold. His responses were uneven, attempts to minimize, fragments of apology that did not match the pattern. Ariana's words to him were short, precise, and final. "I will not let you make me small anymore," she said. "I will not let you write the story of my life as one you control. I will leave, I will divorce, I will build my life without you." She placed, as calmly as one can in a visiting room, a packet on the table, documents confirming the protective order, legal forms she had filed, and the beginnings of a plan. There was a dignity to that moment that was more potent than any flourish. It was not triumphal, it was resolute. She reclaimed language over her body and her choices. In that intense, quiet exchange, I felt both as a mother and as a lawyer that the moment had been earned. The trials left scars. The public spectacle had cost Ariana employment, privacy, and a sense of normalcy. The social media smear had not erased the damage entirely. Friends who had stayed secreted themselves back into lives that had been rearranged. But with time came repair. Ariana moved into a small, sunlit apartment on the east side of the city. She took a position with a different lab that valued her work and provided an environment where she could rebuild her professional reputation without the immediate shadow of those who had sought to intimidate her. She volunteered her time mentoring younger engineers, teaching them practical ways to document and assert boundaries in their labs. There are joys even in slow rebuilding. Learning which coffee shop will become your new ritual, finding a landlord who appreciates punctual rent, rediscovering the pleasures of a weekend morning without fear. And then, cautiously, she opened to the possibility of affection again. There was a man, David, who met her at a mutual friend's book club. He was not flashy. He made tea. He asked questions about her day and listened without interruption. He was patient in a way that had nothing to do with performative stoicism and everything to do with ordinary kindness.
I watched them meet for the first time and felt something like relief, not because she was moving on quickly, but because she was moving forward on her own terms. My professional life did not collapse under the bar inquiry. The complaint was investigated, and after months of inquiry, the bar closed it with a finding that no discipline was warranted. That kind of vindication does not erase the anxiety, but it matters. My license remained intact. I used the ordeal to become an even more outspoken advocate for transparency in bar complaints and for better protections against weaponized professional inquiries. I testified at a state hearing on the subject and joined a committee that drafted guidelines to prevent the misuse of institution-driven harassment. The IRS audit, when it arrived, was bureaucratic and intense, but ultimately limited in scope. Our forensic accountant worked with the Revenue Office, cleared up discrepancies, and the audit closed with minor adjustments and no punitive assessment. These procedural outcomes cannot be separated from the support networks we called upon, from the professionals who chose to stand on facts rather than succumb to pressure. That is a point I want to underline. In battles that involve influence, it is essential to find professionals who understand ethics and the limits of access. Those relationships mattered. There were ripple effects beyond our family. Women who had watched our case write in with stories that were smaller but structurally similar, controlling partners, friends who vanished, employers who hesitated under social pressure. A young mother from a small town sent a message saying she had filed for a protective order after seeing our recordings presented in the press and recognizing the pattern in her own marriage. Another woman in the lab world reached out to say she had kept documentation in a way she might not have otherwise and was now able to address abuse before it escalated. Those notes were, frankly, what kept us going on days when the fury faded into fatigue. I wrote pieces for legal journals about best practices for documenting domestic incidents and about how lawyers can ethically help clients without eclipsing their choices. I began speaking at conferences about the intersection of family law and social media weaponization. I was careful to avoid offering what might be taken as one-size-fits-all legal advice. Legal strategy is context-specific. Instead, I focused on empowering steps: document, preserve communications, seek trustworthy counsel, and prioritize safety. People often ask me how faith factored into the ordeal. My faith is personal. It is woven into family rituals and Robert's habits, the way he always made the coffee, and the way he listened. I do not make public promises about divine certainties.
I can say honestly that in the quiet hours, my faith offered solace, a rhythm to breathe, a community to lean on, a reason to do right things because they are right, not because I can predict the outcome. Many readers will find their own forms of resilience, community, therapy, friendship, or a practice of meditation. Whatever that is, find it. It matters. One practical point I must underscore: survivor agency was central. Ariana decided to press charges. She decided to testify. She chose to stay or leave certain relationships on her timetable. As a mother and as an attorney, I provided options and counsel, but I did not substitute my will for hers. That balance, to help without supplanting, is one of the hardest parts of supporting someone through abuse. In the months after the verdicts, the Harrisons retreated from public life. Some relationships within their network fractured. There were resignations and reassignments where influence had once insulated reputations. Those institutional consequences are not a tidy kind of justice. They are part of the messy way organizations recalibrate when vulnerabilities are exposed. Ariana rebuilt slowly but with integrity. She returned to publishing technical papers. She began a small mentorship program for women in STEM at a local university, advising on workplace boundaries, documentation practices, and how to navigate professional retaliation. She told those students, in a line I have since watched her repeat at different campuses, "You do not owe anyone your silence." Her voice, once small, became a resource. For myself, the case changed some of the contours of my practice. I took on fewer pro bono cases at first, not because I wanted distance, but because the months of trial taught me the cost of absence. I began training junior attorneys to understand the social power plays that often flank domestic cases. I wrote op-eds about the weaponization of institutions and the need for structural safeguards to prevent audits or bar complaints from being used as intimidation. I must say something about forgiveness and anger. Anger does not have to be the permanent homeowner of your heart. There were days when I wanted to shout, to scream, to reduce the history of my daughter's life in order to punish. Those moments were fleeting but real. Over time, they diminished because other things took their place. The work of healing in my daughter, the support of new friendships, the quiet rituals like morning coffee, the task of teaching younger attorneys how to document red flags. Forgiveness, for us, was not an excuse for what happened, nor a release from accountability. It was a way to stop giving emotional space to the perpetrators so we could place those energies on rebuilding. Throughout this, I have kept thinking of Robert. He had this quiet way of naming what is essential in a life. Show up, be present, make sure the people you love have the tools to survive their storms.
It is why, when the press wanted a narrative about a mother vindicated, I refused to make the story about me. It has always and will always be about Ariana's courage and about the institutions that either protect or fail those in danger. If you are watching and you recognize echoes of your life in this story, know this. There is no single right way to proceed, but there are small, practical steps that can help. Document, save messages, identify at least one person who knows where you are. Consider legal options, but do so with counsel you trust. If you can, secure copies of paperwork in multiple locations. Safety planning matters for you, for your children, for anyone else involved. And if you are in immediate danger, contact local authorities or a local shelter. Production will include resources and hotlines in the description and on screen for anyone who needs them. The story I have told is not merely about victory in a courtroom. It is about the stubborn endurance of truth when given space to be heard. It is about a daughter who reclaimed her life, a mother who balanced legal acumen with tenderness, and the many small acts of courage from neighbors, an uneasy cousin, and trusted officers that collectively shifted what seemed immovable. People sometimes ask whether I would do anything differently. The answer is a complicated yes and no. Yes, I would have arranged earlier supports for Ariana's emotional recovery. No, I would not have stayed silent. The decision to act was painful and exhausting, but silence would have had a cost that neither of us could afford.
We made choices that matched a moment and a temperament. Your choices may differ and also be right. This is where I want to close. Truth has a way of finding allies. In our case, those allies were not always the most powerful people in a room. They were a neighbor who overheard a slap, a lab colleague who chose to believe, a detective who followed a paper trail, and a cousin who finally chose conscience over loyalty. Those unlikely alliances are where change often begins. If this story gives anyone courage to step towards safety, to keep a message, to ask a friend to be a witness, then the telling has served its narrow, essential purpose. If you've watched this to the end, please share this with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone. And if you want to hear more survivor stories and practical conversations about how to protect yourself and those you love, subscribe. We will continue to bring these conversations forward with care and with respect. Thank you for listening to Ariana's story and for letting me tell it. It was, at times, unbearable. It was, in its resolution, enough.